I hope everybody has been having a great, enjoyable, and productive time at Discovery. If you haven't yet, please don't miss out on visiting the Young Entrepreneur Zone with more than 100 startups. Thank you again to OMERS for their sponsorship of the zone. Thank you also to the University of Waterloo for sponsoring the Ask an Expert Zone. It has been a very busy area with attendees meeting with mentors and experts in various sectors. We had a great session yesterday with our keynotes from Singularity University. Thank you to Deloitte for co-sponsoring this event with OCE. Our thanks as well to IBM for sponsoring the Big Data Analytics Zone. And thank you, and a big thank you to AMD for bringing us today's lunch. We are excited to now bring you our Day 2 keynote session with Steve Blank, one of Silicon Valley's founders. In a rare Canadian appearance, Steve will be joining us for an intimate and interactive moderated discussion via satellite. Steve is known for developing the customer development methodology which launched what is known as the Lean Startup movement. He has worked for more than 30 years in the high technology industry and has founded or worked with 8 startup companies, 4 of which have gone public. Steve has published 3 books: The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, Not All Those Who Wander Are Lost, and The Startup Owner's Manual. He is a consulting associate professor of entrepreneurship at Stanford University. He also lectured at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley, Columbia University, and the California Institute of Technology. Working with the Entrepreneurship Center at the University of California, San Francisco, Steve created a version of Lean Launchpad for life sciences and healthcare, which he taught there in the fall of 2013. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to advise you that you can be thinking about your own questions for Steve and either ask them at one of our mics on the floor or submit them via our mobile event guide. Once you've logged on, please visit Polls and Feedback section and click on Luncheon and Keynote Address. Let me now introduce Rick Spence, who will be moderating the session. Rick is a writer, speaker, and Financial Post entrepreneurship columnist. Rick, can you please join us on the stage?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Tom, for putting on such a great conference today. Isn't this a great conference? I can't hear you up here. Yeah. So Steve Blank is live via satellite because he doesn't like to travel, so it was really hard getting him to go to the satellite, but we're very glad that he did. A lot of you will know him as the father of the Lean Startup movement, and that's what we're here to talk about. So if you've been working on an organization that's agile, or if you're an advisor who's been telling people to get to their minimum viable product, then these are all concepts that Steve helped introduce to the vocabulary. So it's very exciting at a conference that's all about innovation and commercialization. It's exciting to have the guy who wrote the book on it, well, the books on it, here with us today. So there's 2,500 people in the room, and we want to make sure that as we welcome Steve Blank, that he knows we really appreciate him taking the time to talk to us. Ladies and gentlemen, startup legend Steve Blank.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be at Discovery.
Steve, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. I'm wondering if we can just get started by sort of clearing the air on what things mean in your world. So tell us exactly, if you can, briefly, if you will, tell us what the Lean Startup is. Tell us what innovation means to you. Tell us what commercialization means to you. Happy
to do that, Rick. Though, if you don't mind, I thought I'd maybe even start with some easier definitions of what's an entrepreneur, or what's a startup and what's a founder.
Absolutely.
Because I know this audience is made up of different types of entrepreneurs and different types of startups and different types of early stage ventures. And let me give you about 30 seconds worth of definition. Yeah. Because if you look around, it turns out we use the same words to describe a variety of entrepreneurs and startups, and we get kind of confused when we try to apply the same rules to different types.
Absolutely.
I think of about 5 different types of entrepreneurs and startups. There are those of you who are doing what I call lifestyle businesses. You have some other passion, but you are actually self-employed to just pay for that other passion. That is, you could be an aspiring actor, but you're doing database coding, or you could be a surfer, but you happen to teach surf lessons just to pay the rent. Or number 2 is you could be a small business entrepreneur. This is the core of Canadian entrepreneurship, core of US entrepreneurship. Most self-employed business people are entrepreneurs. They do start companies, but the size, the scale, the funding, the resources, both financial and teams they could acquire, are very different from the next type of entrepreneurs, which in Silicon Valley we kind of call scalable startups. Those entrepreneurs who wake up in the morning and saying, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to have $1 billion company, and I'm going to die trying. Emphasis on die trying. Those type of entrepreneurs, and most of them do, by the way. Those type of entrepreneurs are the ones we read about in TechCrunch or Pando Daily, etc. And there's been a variant in the last 5 or 10 years because startups can be started on your laptop rather than requiring millions of dollars. I call them viable startups. Startups whose exits aren't maybe billions of dollars, but you could flip a nice web or mobile app company for millions of dollars. Those viable and scalable startups are what Silicon Valley kind of focuses on. But it doesn't mean everybody else isn't an entrepreneur. It just means you need to ask yourself which game are you playing. And then finally, there's corporate entrepreneurship. And that's become incredibly important in the last couple of years as large companies are being continually disrupted. Now, I know I didn't answer your first question about lean, but should I continue on those definitions, or should we go elsewhere?
Let's just find out how many of these entrepreneurs we have here. How many scalable entrepreneurs are in the room? Cheer! Come on, we need noise, people. Right. See, that's amazing, because 20 years ago, no one even knew what that meant, so that's fantastic. How many corporate entrepreneurs in the room? Not as many, okay. Let's get back on schedule then.
They have more money.
That's right. Steve, so just help us understand how you came up with a lean startup and what it means to you.
Sure, and I think, the nice thing about the lean startup is it's not very hard to understand. It doesn't require much math. The big observation was that for 50 years in Silicon Valley, our investors told us as entrepreneurs that startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Large companies write business plans, you write business plans. Large companies hire sales, marketing, and biz dev, you do that. Large companies execute to the plan, and everybody succeeds, and if you fail, it's only because you weren't good enough. That was the story. Make a very long story short, I did 8 startups in 21 years, and when I retired, I started thinking about what won and lost and what worked and didn't. And I realized something actually quite heretical at the time, which was startups are nothing like large companies. At their core, and we knew this, we could tell stories about why large company CEOs are different than founders. We had all these apocryphal stories, but no one got it down to this. Large companies execute known business models, but startups search for business models. This distinction between search and execution not only hadn't been articulated, we didn't even have any tools for search. We had spent the last 100 years with business schools building great strategies and great tactics and great organizational theory about execution inside a corporation. But with all due respect, none of those business school professors have typically run a lemonade stand, let alone a startup. And therefore, the answer was, well, how hard can a startup be? I'm consulting for a company of 100,000 people. Turns out, 2 people in a garage is actually quite different than 100,000 people in a large corporation. So the setup was, I realized we need a different theory and a new set of tools to actually even address what entrepreneurs and founders face on a day-to-day basis. Is that the setup? And then I could explain what lean is and how it came from it.
Sure, why don't we go straight into that? That makes my job so much easier. Yep.
Because if you don't stop me, the hour will be over and we're done. So it turns out the lean startup now really has three components. They're all based on the fact that for a startup, there are no facts inside your building. This is a big idea.
Sorry, can you say that again? There are no facts inside your building?
Inside your building. And that while you might be the smartest person in your building, there is no possible way you could be smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customer. That's a big idea. And idea number two is, I remind my students at Stanford and Berkeley that while you believe as a founder, you deeply understand the customer problem and you could just go build the solution, the reality is all you have is a series of untested hypotheses. And because my students at Stanford pay $50,000 a year, I use the word hypotheses. But outside of Stanford, that real word is just guesses. And if you really think about it, founders are essentially guessing about most of their components of their business. And the whole idea of the lean startup is it's probably, if you just think about it, a lot more effective to validate them, meaning test your guesses before you spend a lot of time and money on it, regardless of how passionate you are. And the lean startup is simply a set of three components that allow you to do that. Right. And so finally we get to answer your question.
Right. I think we're getting somewhere on this. So the phrase that I first heard associated with your work is customer development. Can you just tell us what that means?
Sure. Customer development is the second part of three parts. Customer development says, let's get outside of the building in a formal process to test all these hypotheses, all these guesses that might make up my business. And what really confuses founders is confusing their idea, which might be their technology or their insight or whatever, with all the other pieces that make up a successful company. What's the channel? How do I create demand? What's pricing? Who's competitors? What kind of partners do I need? What kind of costs? And what we do with customer development is we set up experiments and we get outside the building and test all of them.
So if there's anyone tweeting this, we can sum it up in 140 characters or less and still include your hashtag SGBlank at SGBlank. We could say, get out of your building, there's no facts there. I mean, that's the
right.
essence of it. Yeah, fantastic. Why is it so hard for people to do that? I mean, I know so many entrepreneurs who really like their office or their garage or their workshop, and they leave there only reluctantly.
You know, that's probably the million-dollar question. And in fact, it gets to the core of what makes a founder in entrepreneurship. That is, a founder is a visionary. A founder sees something or hears something that other people don't. And we'll talk a little later that founders are closer to artists than any other profession. But it turns out, if you're a founder and you envision something new, the odds are you're hallucinating, not being a visionary. You're actually seeing things that aren't there. And so to differentiate this hallucination from this vision requires you to get out of the building and actually validate, is that a mirage? That is my passion overwhelming the rest of my senses? Or am I going to be just believing everything I'm hearing internally? And that's the conundrum. That's what makes customer development hard. It's not technically hard. It just goes against the DNA of a founder that says, I know, let me just build it. Get out of my way. We're going to remove all the obstacles. Come on, you're with me. And I'm asking them to do something different in the back of their head. I'm asking them to have, like in the days of ancient Rome, when the Caesars were parading their triumphs through the streets of Rome, they would have a slave standing in back of the Caesar whispering, but you too are mortal. I am that little voice in the back of your head which says, maybe you're just hallucinating. Maybe we're all just guessing.
Okay, just give us a couple examples. What are the best ways to get that feedback from customers? How do we do that development work?
Right. Well, you know, I'll throw in the other two components of the lean startup. One is customer development. The first piece is we actually use some work from someone named Alexander Osterwalder, who wrote a book called Business Model Generation. to kind of line up these hypotheses on a single page called the business model canvas. And so the first piece of a lean startup is actually articulating your hypotheses on the business model canvas. Then the next step is customer development. But the third step, which allows us to test these hypotheses, is we set up the hypothesis testing just like a science experiment. What kind of experiment do we want to run? What kind of feedback do we expect? What kind of data did we get? And did it drive any changes to the hypotheses? And we usually build something called an MVP. Eric Ries, who has contributed enormously to this field, I used to call it the minimum feature set. Eric had a much better name for it. Called the minimum viable product. Says, why don't we either build a smaller version of the product or actually little pieces to test different parts of the business model canvas that don't even have to be directly associated with the product, and we'll run a series of tests and see if we get back what we expect. And here's the big idea. It's a huge idea. In the old days, investors would expect you to execute per the plan, and if there was any failure, it was your problem. You personally failed, and the first attempt to fix it will require firing an executive. First, we fired the VP of sales, then we fired the VP of marketing, and then if we haven't run out of money, we fire the founder. Nowadays, we know something a lot more important. We know startups go from failure to failure, learning as fast as they can. And this process allows us to do that learning as quickly as we can. Did I answer anything of what you asked?
I think so. What do we do for the shy people? Is there any way of doing this customer development work without actually making them talk to customers?
No.
No? Sorry. I tried, okay? I tried.
It turns out that we make, when we teach this to either 22-year-olds in hoodies and flip-flops, or teach this to scientists and 52 years old, we make them, by the time they're done with this class and the process we teach, they've talked to 100 customers eyeball to eyeball in 10 weeks. Let me tell you, there's no faking that data. There is no denying what you heard. And it is not that hard. It's actually a process. You know, my rule when I particularly teach scientists and engineers is that I remind them the difference between an introvert and an extrovert is whether they're looking at their shoes or my shoes. And I managed to teach them how to make eye contact in 10 weeks. It's not that hard. It's teachable.
All right. I see so many entrepreneurs in my work, especially the young ones, who have the vocabulary down straight, and I think this methodology, these theories have done so much to help focus people on what to do and how to do it. Are you in any position, Steve, to sort of assess the impact of the lean startup revolution? What kind of impact do you think it's having?
Well, you know, every once in a while, Eric Ries and I and Alexander Osterwalder would get together, and I'd always ask, you know, what if we're wrong? Are we going to set back the world of startups about 20 years? And I think the generic conclusion is it can't be any worse than what we've been doing. And that was how at least I motivated myself for the first 5 years. But now there's no longer being facetious. About 3 years ago, the United States government, the National Science Foundation, our premier research organization, adopted this process, and more importantly, my class at Stanford called the Lean Launchpad, as the standard for commercialization of all science in the United States. And they've been measuring and monitoring its results. They've called it now the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps. And as you heard in the introduction, we actually prototyped a version of that class for life sciences, for therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, and digital health. And the results there actually turned out clinicians and researchers were even better at customer development than scientists and engineers. And so it looks like this fall, the National Institute of Health, our medical research organization, federal research organization, will be running this in 4 divisions of the NIH to pilot whether they want to scale this as well. So there is some data, and I want to make it clear, I don't think the lean startup will make you Google or Facebook or Twitter or Dropbox or whatever. I think the way to think about it, if I'm an entrepreneur, is it will give me more shots at the goal than if I did any other method. It allows you to iterate and or we use the word pivot to basically get multiple chances at getting it right. It just allows us to husband our resources, because a lean startup is not a cheaper startup. A lean startup, it just tells us when and where we put our resources before we spend a lot of money.
Right.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. So a lot of the concern I think that I've heard expressed about this theory is that it seems really well built for software companies and internet companies where you can start selling before you build anything, and you can iterate and change so quickly. But if someone's doing a different type of startup, whether it's, you know, building a store or factory or getting into biotech, does it really apply there? Can those types of entrepreneurs pivot in the same kind of way that you assume in the lean methodology?
Yeah, you know, that's I find that so funny, only because it's kind of an inside joke. But when I wrote the book, it was about enterprise software, not about the internet. And of course, when Eric Ries became the first practitioner of customer development, it actually happened to be in an internet company. And when Eric popularized it, it became associated with the internet, not because of anything bad. It's just that the people who, in fact, desperately needed it, who had minimum resources, were actually people developing over Amazon Web Services in their laptop, and this turned out to be a perfect match for their limited resources. But as I mentioned, the National Science Foundation, you know, we've put 300 teams of, you know, material scientists and robotics and whatever, and you know, our UCSF and NIH class, as I mentioned, have nothing to do with, or very little to do with internet companies. In fact, the life sciences world was the one place where I said it wouldn't work, and was stunned to find out it actually did, because the entire business model of therapeutics and devices have changed radically, where in fact the partners that startups need are actually looking for collaboration with them. Right. So understanding a business model early there is actually quite important. And to answer a very specific question, I thought the world's worst place to do this would be in therapeutics, that is, developing drugs, legal drugs. It would work for any other drug very easily, but for legal drugs, I thought, you know, it would take years to have a collaboration with a pharma company. Turns out that customer development and the lean startup process actually helps you figure out what type of data you need to provide a pharma company, and you could get a collaboration within 18 months if you were actually using this process to understand product market fit, which is a fancy term for how does your product fit the customer needs. If you understand that deeply, you could nail that in a way you never could before, right, using fractional the amount of money that traditional biotech companies raise.
Fantastic. What do you think is the part of your work in the lean startup that is most misunderstood? What are the parts people either don't get or forget or tend to skip?
Well, the customer development is hard. And again, we talked about this earlier, is that it's hard not because it's physically hard, but because it goes against the DNA and culture of a founder. And I not only understand that, I get it, and just want to acknowledge to everybody in the room. And two is, the whole founding team needs to buy into this. The worst thing that you could do is assign this to one of your employees. If you just did that, you're dead. You might as well not do it unless somebody wanted you to tell them that you were doing it. But, you know, I'll write you a note that you're doing it so you can skip it. But the founders truly need to be engaged in this, because they're the only ones who could pivot. And my definition of a pivot is a substantive change to one or more of the business model canvas components, meaning we changed our customer segment, we changed our pricing, we changed our partners or our demand creation strategy, or we even changed our product. Typically, only the founders could make those decisions, not a proxy. Right. And typically, only the founders could take that input that they're hearing firsthand and go, well, what do you mean you don't like the product? And then go to, 6 other people and then wonder, they hate my baby. They're telling me it's ugly, and then check to make sure that you're holding the right end of the baby up. Maybe you're showing them the wrong end. And then finally, only then could they decide, maybe I need to listen deeper. You can't do that through proxies. That's number one, probably the hardest part. The other part is not understanding that now this is for founders. When you've become a founder, you've basically have given up your job as an engineer or business person. You've become an artist. And by artist, I mean, we kind of got this wrong for the last 50 years. Founders are closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that other people don't. They hear things that other people don't. And in fact, what they're looking for is insight out of this data. So that's what I would say is probably hardest.
When you said they were a lot like artists, I thought you meant because they were both starving, but I guess I like your answer better.
Or kill themselves at the end. I mean,
just cut off your ear. Don't do that. Don't.
Founders have a different emotional and makeup than people who have 9-to-5 jobs. I think most people in your audience understand that. Founders are driven from at least founders in my definition of scalable startups and viable startups, are vision from the passion of creation. That's the artist metaphor. They couldn't care less whether they made $1 billion or not. Yeah, you might, but boy, getting your product used by millions of people, or seeing your idea, that the sketch of the napkin in use in hospitals, or a drug or a robot, if you don't have that passion, you're confusing it with a job or something that's trendy. That is the other problem I see, is that entrepreneurship is now cool. I think that's crazy, because entrepreneurship and startups are not a job. This is a big idea. This is not a job. Entrepreneurship and founding a company, it's a calling. If you're not called to this, don't do this, because it's the world's most miserable job. It's the most exciting calling in the world, but it is a miserable job. The odds, all of you should look around in the room, almost all of you are going to fail. Almost all of you are going to fail. And if you're a great entrepreneur, that's not going to bother you, because you're going to do it because you believe. In fact, all of you looking around, I hope the ones that are true believers are feeling sorry for everybody else in the room, because it's going to be you that's going to succeed.
I'm sorry you can't see this, Steve, because we don't have a camera facing into the audience, but we've got 2,500 people in here. This is the biggest room in Toronto that doesn't have a hockey rink or a pitcher's mound. Everyone is laughing, they're nodding their heads, they really get this. So I think this is fantastic information for everyone. Thank you. Tell me a little bit about you.
Let me just riff one more second. I got to tell you, for 21 years in Silicon Valley, when I was an entrepreneur, I still remember the days I was driving into work, wondering if this was the day they were going to ask me to pay to work there, and I was figuring out how much I could afford to do that. If that's not how you feel, don't do a startup. It's not worth it. You're better off working at Walmart or McDonald's for the odds and for the pay. It's because you want to see something happen, and you can't think of anything more wonderful to do with your next 20 years. And if that's not how you feel, the world of capitalism is great. Other people will pay you for your talents 9 to 5.
All right, thank you. Just a reminder, we will be going to questions soon, so if you've got a question or start thinking about it, you can text it, or you can go to one of the 4 microphones in the front and the center here, and we'll get to that soon. Steve, I got to ask you, just let's look back on your career. We talked a little bit about the chances of success. You actually had a pretty good track record. I think it's 8 startups that you've been involved with. 4 of them went public. You've called them a few base hits and 2 craters and 1 dot-com home run. So looking back, what did you actually find about what made the difference between success and failure in the businesses you were in?
Well, let me talk about the failures first, since most people don't do that. One of my startups, which I personally was responsible for, left a crater so deep it has its own iridium layer. They'll be digging it up 65 million years from now as well. In fact, I realized I was going out of business 90 days after I was on the cover of Wired magazine. You know, after the company went out of business, I called my mother, who was a Russian immigrant, and both my parents were immigrants, and first generation American, which is truly an American, you know, capitalism story. And English wasn't my mother's first language, and so I knew I had to pause every time I would talk to her to simultaneous translation. And, you know, I said, Mom, I'm calling you to let you know I lost $35 million. Pause. And longer pause. And she was processing it, and then she said, oh, where'd you put it? I said, no, I lost it, and it's gone. And then she broke into Russian and Polish and multiple languages, and most of them came out to be, you know, we can't change her name, it's already blank. and then too is, there's nowhere for us to go. The country we came from is gone. And I tried to explain to her that the, you know, VCs who gave me that $35 million, I was calling her to let her know they just decided to give me another $12 million for my next company. And in fact, that story actually is not a story about me, but it's a story about entrepreneurship. You know you're in an entrepreneurial cluster where the word failure actually equals experience. It's a big idea. If in fact, if you're in a place where failure means you literally are embarrassed, have to leave, you know, will never work again, etc., you're not in an entrepreneurial culture, and you need to leave and go find one. But in Canada, there are plenty of entrepreneurial clusters of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and Calgary, you know, clusters around universities like Waterloo and the rest. But those are rare occurrences in any country, not just Canada. You know, it doesn't occur in every city and every place. So to answer your question, I learned a ton about failure in that one company, Rocket Science, that there are many failure modes of a startup, and this one was hubris.
Hubris?
I believed my own press. I had a pretty good reality distortion field and actually started reading my press clippings rather than, in fact, staying connected with the customers. In fact, in that case, the problem was I actually discovered who my customers were and hated them. They were 14-year-old boys.
We've been there.
And so I do have another heuristic that says if you find yourself disliking your customers, you should leave the company and hand it to someone else, because you will never actually do product market fit well. I don't know if that's good enough for what I learned, but I'd say I learned most from the failures than I did from the successes.
Right, I think we all do that. Can you just tell me, what are some of the startups out there, or the new businesses, or the technology businesses we might have heard of that you admire? Who's doing it right?
Well, for me, the best one may or may not be a surprise, but I think Elon Musk is probably the founder of both SpaceX and Tesla, had his hand in Solar City as well, is probably the truest DNA of Silicon Valley legacy than anybody else, much more than Facebook or Twitter or the software companies. Or maybe it's just because I'm an old hardware guy and kind of like people who, but you know, reinventing how we go to space and then saying I want to land on Mars. Well, actually, he said he wants to die on Mars. He just said not on landing, which I thought was the world's greatest quote. And reinvented the automobile industry. Not bad for a guy in his 40s, and he's, you know, barely started. I think of him as in the kind of the, you know, Walt Disney, Edward Land, Steve Jobs kind of heroic entrepreneur, founder, scalable startup category.
I should, by the way, mention that Walt Disney had a Canadian parent, and Elon Musk graduated from Trent University in Ontario. So we thank you for mentioning these great Canadian entrepreneurs.
Who all went to Silicon Valley.
And I wanted to ask you, a lot of Canadians in Silicon Valley, you've probably run into some of them, some Canadian startups, maybe some Canadian technologies. Any thoughts from you on the Canadian entrepreneurs you've met or the Canadian businesses you've seen and how we might do better in the global marketplace?
Massive disadvantage if you're a Canadian.
Massive. Uh-oh.
You guys are way too nice. And I'm only being half facetious. You know, obviously, there's not one model that fits it all, and a cultural stereotype is just what it is a stereotype. But you know, Americans were, you know, basically it's a Darwinian culture, and Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship at its core, besides being a creative culture, is also Darwinian. And that requires a struggle and just passion that I would not always associate Canadians with passion. And I don't mean that all Canadians aren't passionate, but in business, this really requires a struggle of creation. I mean, entrepreneurship is a violent act. It's not a passive activity. And anybody who tells you you could do it sitting in your dorm room or in your room is just confused. It's a full contact, but in fact, Canadians actually should be great because entrepreneurship is probably closer to hockey than anything else. It's a full contact, full body sport. In fact, you're missing teeth by the time you're done. All hockey players are, you know, probably should be world-class entrepreneurs. But I just will point out, why is it people come to Silicon Valley? It's not because there's anything smarter going on. In fact, there are equally smart entrepreneurs in Canadian clusters as well, certainly around Canadian universities and entrepreneurs I've met. But in fact, it's the density of entrepreneurship, along with the other thing that actually isn't quite understood, is not only do you need entrepreneurial density, but you need a financial asset class that we call risk capital or venture capital. And these people are crazier than the entrepreneurs. And if you don't have that, you only have one hand clapping. Mm-hmm. That is, an entrepreneurial cluster requires risk capital and entrepreneurs. And right. What I mean risk capital, in the US, when I came out to Silicon Valley in the late 1970s, it wasn't clear whether Boston or Silicon Valley was going to win. And at least my take is the distinction was, in Boston, the venture capitalists continued to act like bankers. And in Silicon Valley, they decided to act like pirates. And the pirates won. My test of whether some area will be a cluster is how crazy and deep-pocketed are the entrepreneurs. Not how much is the government funding it, how deep-pocketed are the financial asset class of risk capital. Are there crazy angels? Is there deep pocket, you know, Series A and B who are willing to push the money on the table? When you find that, then you know you have a potential cluster.
How many crazy angels in the room? I got to tell you, there's a few hands.
Great. How many crazy Series A and B investors in the room?
Crazy Series A and B investors. Yeah, we got a few of those too. Stay after.
Great. The line forms next to those guys.
The line forms next to you. Okay. Just because you brought up the whole financing thing, a question I have just about the lean methodology, how does that, or does it, change the relationship between entrepreneurs and venture capitalists? Does it change the balance of power at all? Does it make any difference?
Well, you know, number one is, at least in the last couple of years, I find it very funny. Almost every VC now says, oh, yeah, we get the lean stuff. And then they go, show me your 5-year income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. You know, it's kind of like an oxymoron with an emphasis on the second syllable. You know, by the way, my observation with another part of thinking about this is, you know, if you think about a 5-year forecast for a startup, you're essentially asking a startup to forecast 5 years of a series of unknowns. And in the whole history of the world, the only people who required a 5-year plan based on unknowns were venture capitalists and the Soviet Union. And we know how well that turned out, at least for both of them. You know, so it was kind of like random luck about why these forecasts actually meant anything. But to be serious, it turns out that entrepreneurs who do some of the lean startup method, I guess number one mistake I see them make in front of investors is actually selling them the lean process. You should separate out the religion from what it taught you. And what I remind the people who've been through the process is, what you want to communicate is, what did you learn by getting out of the building? Now, when I teach teams, they've spoken to 100 customers or partners or something else. You have to have learned something. What I want to know is not just, here's what I think now. There's an interesting 3-slide story that says, here's what I thought when I started the company. Here's what I thought when like 40 people told me this was a dumb idea, and here's how I pivoted, and here's where I am now, and therefore here's where I need your money and what for. You could make a very great lean startup pitch without ever using the word lean or customer development or anything else. You know, I guess that's the shorthand. And I don't know if I answered your question, but you could try it again.
Well, we're going to throw some more questions at you. So we're going to invite you to come to the microphones. We've got about 20 minutes, so we're going to ask you to keep your questions very short. And if you go past like 30 seconds or you try and make a speech, then I'm going to cut you off, okay? I'm not a nice guy. We have a question, first of all, that came from the app. What's the best way to engage university students in entrepreneurial thinking? How do we get them to think like entrepreneurs, students?
Yeah, you know, this is a really great question, because when I started teaching, I brought my biases as an entrepreneur into the game, and I just assumed that all we needed to teach them was the lean startup process, and they were ready to go, and that's how you engage them. And actually found that that was a bias of mine, is that I still even today am full of new ideas, and here's what we should do, and here's how we would solve the problem. But I realized in teaching university students entrepreneurship that they need a front-end class for creativity and innovation. And in fact, I would put that before you even learn the lean startup. The best way to engage students in a university would probably to have a general innovation and creativity class. At Stanford, Tina Seelig teaches probably the best class of that in the country, and she's put it online. And there are others who do it in other universities. So the answer is, I'd engage them with a front-end innovation and creativity class. I'd also, in fact, would encourage, and I know I've seen them in multiple places in Canada, either startup weekends or lean startup machines. That is, these 2 or 3 day weekend events of getting potential entrepreneurs just to kind of get a feel of what is this startup stuff like. And by the way, I think the most important thing those things could do is discourage people from wanting to be entrepreneurs. I mean, I think there's enough encouragement out there in the popular press, etc. But as I said, it's a dirty, tough job. And if you get a taste of it and you go, you got to be kidding, 24/7 for the next 20 years? I'm taking that job at McKinsey. What are you thinking about? I think that's a great idea. I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic, thank you. Let me just ask you, what's the best way to get people to help them spot opportunities? We know that some entrepreneurs, every time they see a setback or have a complaint, they see, this could be a business. But most Canadians would just shrug and say, that's the way it is. How do we get people to spot opportunities?
You know, that's one of those, is the glass half full or half empty thing. And as I said, there are classes in innovation and entrepreneurship and opportunity. The phrase you're describing is opportunity assessment. And it's just a way of thinking. And some people are actually, I am, and which I said, it made me actually a bad teacher for a while, because I just am hardwired for that, assumed everybody else was. And in fact, most people aren't. It's actually a bad part of brain chemistry, because it gets you in a lot of trouble. Is you get in a car accident and you think there's a new product involved. I mean, most people are like going to the hospital. And so, but I think your question also brings up part of the DNA of an entrepreneur is tenacity and resilience and agility and insight. some of which can be trained, and some of which are hardwired. And which brings you back to the question of, can entrepreneurship be taught or not? Is implicitly in your first two questions. And let me just make this clear. When I started teaching entrepreneurship, all my friends who knew me as an entrepreneur were laughing hysterically. They said, "You were born entrepreneur. You know you can't teach this stuff." And I struggled with that for a decade, and I now have an answer that I don't think anybody else has come up with. Of course you could teach entrepreneurship, but you can only teach it to those who passionately want to learn it. Entrepreneurship it's again, like wanting to be an artist. You can't split this audience, and the left-hand side of the room, you're going to be entrepreneurs, and the right-hand side of the room, you're working in the factory. It doesn't work that way. Okay. You've got to desperately want to do this. And if you don't desperately want to do this, don't go near it. Sorry to...
All right, okay.
We
have a bunch of questions, so we'll ask you to keep the questions short and the answers short, and we'll get through as many of these as we can. Okay, it's a deal. And at the back of the room, microphone 4, please go ahead.
Hey, Steve. Thank you for being here. Just got a question. So I run a crowdfunding platform for charities and donors. It's a marketplace. So when dealing with a two-sided marketplace, which side do you recommend going after first?
Yes.
Nice one.
So I mean, this is the classic, right? And in fact, just to put in context what this great question asked is, you have a multi-sided market. You know, there are users and payers. Much like Google is a multi-sided market for search, right? Most of us are users, but the people who use AdSense are payers. And the question is, do you go for 10 million users and figure out a monetization strategy later, assuming you can, or do you go and validate there are payers? The answer is, it's a complicated question, depends on the business model you've chosen. In the internet world, boy, if you can't tell me you're going to get 10 million users for a general purpose site, probably not worth doing. But in other businesses, I would suggest going after the payers. So I don't want to give you a glib yes answer for one of them. It really depends on what business you're in.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to microphone 2.
Okay, you talked a little bit about the entrepreneurial culture that exists in Silicon Valley, and you talked a little bit about other types of cultures in business environments. I was just wondering maybe if you could pass on some of the experiences you've had with the companies that have focused on culture inside their own organization, things like vision, mission, and culture.
Yeah, culture is really underrated because it gets confused with free sodas and free food, and you could bring your dog to work. Culture is deeper than that, and if the founders don't, excuse me, don't make a concerted effort on day one to actually articulate it and actually live it, you'll find that the culture emerges kind of chaotically and might not be what you want to have happen. So the biggest thing I could observe is founders need to actually spend some time at regular interviews reviewing their culture and reviewing how the culture is scaling, which is a bigger idea. We've seemed to have learned nothing from the last 2,000 years of history. When startups go from 8 people to 16 to 45 to 150, they're actually replicating organizations that the Roman Legion and the militaries of the world have figured out on actually how teams form at different size and scale. And at every size and scale, you need to revisit the culture. And I just want to emphasize again, it's not about the food. It's not just about, what you could wear or what your hours are. It's about, are you committed to customers? Are you committed to profit? Or, what comes first, second, or third? And is this lip service, or when the stuff hits the fan? The biggest financial fraud in the U.S., or one of them, was Enron. And in their boardroom, as they were actually conspiring to defraud customers in the country, they had posters about corporate ethics. So don't confuse the posters with corporate ethics with actually having corporate ethics and mission.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's go to microphone 1 right in the front here.
Yeah, Mr. Blank, thanks very much for joining us today. We're doing a solar social enterprise in Tanzania, and we actually did the Lean for Social Impact with Acumen, so thanks very much for that as well. My question is with the MVP. So for enterprises, social enterprises in particular, it's very difficult and costly to get to the MVP. And funders require traction, MVP, customer feedback. So how do you reconcile those two different areas so that people can actually get traction, get an MVP, but very cost effectively? Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm going to use an example not in social solar in Tanzania, but a general MVP example. Again, for those of you to remember, an MVP stands for minimum viable product. That is the smallest possible thing you could build to get some learning about which part of your business model is correct or not. That is your hypothesis testing. And I'm going to give you a short story. As a bunch of students took my class, called me later, said, Steve, we're raising $100,000 for a seed stage. We're building a drone to go over farm fields to figure out whether the fields have enough water and nutrients. And we're going to put a hyperspectral scanner on the drone, and it was exciting. And wow, that's great. What do you need the $100,000 for? Well, Professor Blank, we're building the drone, a small version of the drone, and going to get a small camera and whatever. And I said, well, you don't need $100,000. You need about 50. No, Professor Blank, let us explain it to you again. I guess you're implicitly, I guess you're old and stupid. So let me explain it again. We're building the drone and we need a smaller drone. I said, no, you don't. I said, what's your business? Well, we're going to provide data to farmers. And I said, well, do the farmers care whether the data came from a drone? Silence. No. Would they care if it came from a helicopter? No. Airplane? No. Camera with a stick on it that you ran through the field? No. Would in fact a viable MVP mean have you mock up the data and show it to farmers and ask them if they would pay for that? Silence. Why, yes, it would. And turns out, by the way, in the US, these guys actually went through their business and found out they didn't need drones at all. It turns out in the US, there are crop dusting services, they now call them agricultural aerial sprayers, that fly over farms as well. They just mounted their cameras on those crop dusters, who now not only became a platform, but became a distribution channel. I'm trying to answer a very domain-specific question with a more generic view of what an MVP is. An MVP is not always a smaller version of your larger product. You need to think more creatively on how to solve the problem for your donors. Sorry for the long story.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. We're going to go to the cyberspace now for another question. Do you believe the startup world is just a bubble? And is it going to pop? And if so, when?
Well, I think there's two questions embedded in one. The startup world is not a bubble. It's not going away. I think the real interesting question is, are the valuations a bubble? And the answer is sure. When valuations get disconnected from any rational, reason for them to exist, you're in a bubble, and it's the greater fool theory. And particularly when the investors, who are the ones going to make money for you being the fool at the table, telling you it's not a bubble, then it's definitely a bubble. And so when all the VCs are telling you, oh, it's not a bubble at all, you kind of know you're in a bubble. But startups, I think the stuff that all of you are doing, this ain't going away. It's not going back to how it used to be. I think the question is where you could get funding and at what valuation. I would take the money now and hold on to it.
Right. Okay. Another question from the cloud refers to your remarks, Steve, about entrepreneurs being like artists. And artists often aren't good at process. So how do we get entrepreneurs to really master all the processes that are required of running a successful growth business?
Well, that's kind of the yin and yang of a startup. And what's really interesting, and I had never been taught, and I don't think we understood it at the time, is that the goal of a startup is not to become a startup. Big idea. In fact, when I was an entrepreneur, definition of a startup, there was some Harvard School, definition. I found none of them useful. So let me share with you my definition and then answer the question about process. My definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. A couple interesting components. The goal of a startup is not to be a startup. It's to be a large company. Therefore, it's temporary. The goal of a startup is not to code or not to do hardware or software to even get customers. The goal is to search for something that's repeatable and scalable. And what you're looking for is a business model. You know, who are the customers? What's the product? What's the channel? You're looking for all that stuff. And to answer your question, it turns out that what we never understood is that the search goes from you're a startup searching to eventually you're a large company executing. And in the middle, there's a secret phase that your investors never tell you about where they fire the founder, which is they bring in an operating executive to do the building of the process. It turns out founders are the world's best people to operate in chaos. In fact, this is a good test for all of you in the room. If you don't raise your hand when I ask how many of you operate well in chaos, you should not be in the founding team of an early stage venture. Founders hate process. Why? For all the right reasons. They're great at search. Eventually, you need to build process, and then you need to execute it.
Okay, we have three. Thank you very much, Steve. We have 3 people at the mics. We're going to try and get to them. We've just got a couple minutes, so please make your question as short as you can and your answer as short as you can, and we're going to be cool and get through this. Mic number 3.
Henry Ford said that if he gave people what they were asking for, we'd have faster horses, not cars. Same with Steve Jobs. He says,
Let me answer the question.
Go ahead.
So I'm trying to be, it turns out the other mistake we've made, and that's a great example of not that you made a mistake, but we've used to confuse in our heads. Turns out there are 4 types of startups. And Jobs and Ford were talking about just one type. And I'm going to explain them, I'm going to give you the semester in 30 seconds. You could decide you're entering an existing market. If you enter an existing market, you have a higher performance product of something that exists. The market exists, the customers are there, the competitors are there. There are a series of knowns, and you could do customer discovery. I'll jump now to the Steve Jobs and Henry Ford thing. You could be entering a new market. What do we know about a new market? Nothing. No customers, no competitors. All we have is your vision. Doing customer discovery there is really hard because you're answering very, very, very different questions. And it turns out there are 2 other markets. You could be resegmenting an existing market, or you could be cloning a market in India or in Russia or in China, etc. Jobs and Ford were talking about new market creation where it requires visionaries. Good number of startups, in fact more than half, are usually in existing or resegmented markets. Longer explanation in my books or my blogs.
Right.
But it's a great question.
Number 4 at the back, and please be as brief as possible.
Perfect. When you're doing customer discovery, what is the best way to actually collect and track that information so that you can find the insights later, or that you can find the insights and go back? What's better than a notebook?
You know, and I don't want to flack something I developed, but I will. I have this exact same problem in trying to teach my students, and then for the National Science Foundation in collecting customer development data. So we invented a piece of software which ended up turning into a separate company called Launchpad Central. You should take a look at that website. There are other pieces of software just like that. That happens to be the one I helped start and actually use in all my classes that collects all this stuff. And there are other packages that do the same as well. So just kind of start with the Launchpad Central and go look around, and you will see other customer discovery type of applications.
Thank you, Steve. We have one more question from microphone number 2.
And this is the best question, right?
This is the best question. We've arranged the best for last.
So I actually had a similar problem. I love talking to customers, and when I go talk to them, I usually run into 2 problems. One, that they are always too nice to me. They will never criticize. They'll say, I love it, it's amazing. That doesn't help me at all. Secondly is what he mentioned before is I always trying to find, I find that like when I'm talking to a customer, I'm only picking up.
Let's answer your first question first.
Okay.
for time. So there's about a couple of things you're doing in customer discovery. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your view of the problem, how important it is, and all its pieces is shared by people outside your building. So one is you want to do discovery to make sure your understanding of the problem and its importance, whether it's a need or a product, is correct. The second you want to do is understand whether your solution to the problem you've now validated actually matches, what they would pay for or use. And the best way to do that is if you think you understood the problem and you think they're nodding yes for the solution, ask them, great, how much money do you have in your wallet now? And make them take it out and put it in an envelope and say, I am sealing up this envelope, and if I deliver this product, I know it's unfinished, I know it's just a spec, but let's agree that what you just gave me in your wallet, you're going to be the first paying customer. Do we agree? And if they go, well, I was only kidding, you've just done customer validation and found out that most people will do exactly what you just said and be nice to you until you ask for money. Asking for money is the toughest thing for a founder, particularly a non-business founder, to go do. And you will get good at it or you will starve to death and go out of business. Right. Selling is not someone else's job. If there's any one advice that gets lost in this whole lean startup process, this is not some theoretical. Sales is now your job. So is marketing. We're just calling it all about customer discovery and validation, but your job is to get revenue for your company.
All right.
With that,
fantastic. I think we're going to leave it there. Steve, there are 4 types of speakers, and you're the best.
thanks, guys.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Corr, President and CEO of Ontario Centres of Excellence. He will officially thank Steve. So Steve, hang on for just one more minute.
And that was the best interview I ever had.
Thank you, Steve and Rick, and thanks to you in the audience for your questions. That was a great discussion that covered a lot of territory and left us all much more informed about the Lean Start philosophy. Thanks again. Thanks, Steve.